Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to this talk. My name is Sumit Amar, and I work at Visa in San Francisco, and I'm happy to be here. Quick thing first I want to mention is the disclaimer that my viewpoints are my own, not my company's, to get that out of the way. Agenda today, it's a bridges talk, very small talk. We're going to talk about the RESTful principles a little bit, the HATEOAS, hypermedia as the engine of application state, although it starts with hate, but there's some love in it. And also OData, Open Data Framework for Data Retrieval. I'm not going to talk about GraphQL. I'm going to talk about OData instead. So you should have some options. And we're also going to touch upon on the webhooks a little bit. These are things we're going to cover in the RESTfulness. Starting with, please make your entity names plural. It doesn't mean that this is the universal standard. Many production APIs I have seen have singular names for their entities or resources. I like plural because when you create an entity in the database, a table, you put multiple records in it. So that's my simple justification for it. Also, your API should look semantically English-like or your native language-like, if you can replace get with your native language, that is. I'm joking about that, obviously. So get users is trying to return you a collection of users objects. In my mindset, I always put these entities as either the instances or collections. Instance is one record, collection is more than one record. And we're going to take some examples of this in the next slides as well. You already are familiar with HTTP methods, so I'm not going to talk about all these. However, I'm going to touch upon options. Options is a method that returns you the available HTTP methods on your resource. Why it's important is because if you don't have that, the developer is going to find out the hard way anyways. But then also intelligent thing you can do is you can check for the developers or whoever is making API call to your system's authorization rules and find out what method they should be actually calling, so only return those. Because otherwise, even if you return options to have all the 5 methods available or 6 methods, but then they don't have access to one of those, you will return the error anyways. So you could do a little bit of a dynamicness here. Now, I'm also going to talk about the entity relationship in a very basic way. These REST JSON objects are very basic, where we are showing that we're trying to create a player object, and then we have 3 items sent, and the data gets, the player entity gets created. You return 201 created status code. It's not just a meager 200 OK, because you want to tell more meaningfully what actually has just happened. Also, you will notice in this body that is returned, there's an ID for the player also returned. Now, as I talked about earlier, we're going to talk about these entities as the instances or the collections. So in this case, I want to work on the instance of this player 1A that was just created. And I want to create, now that I have this instance of player, I can create trophies object on it, which will be aggregated with this player. Obviously, they're not actually getting embedded inside the entity in your tables in the backend, but semantically in your API, they look related. So you can see very basic. I create a Mario game, give the trophy name, and also a 201 created for the trophy. Next thing we look at, when we try to retrieve this instance of this player, we'll be able to see the player data that we already had. And then we also have the trophies collection, considering that I created multiple trophies. So you can see that now there's a relationship of players which has multiple entities that are related to that. I will come back to that topic in a second. Can you read all of this? We're not going to talk about this, don't worry. In a nutshell, everything that is starting with 200 is OK. Things are working the way they were designed. And also, everything is 300 plus is also fine, but just that they don't actually, they're not the way they seem. So for example, 301, 302 might be moved resources, and then 304 is something that came from the cache, although you just get the response that you're expecting anyways. Everything starting with 400, arguably, is a user error. And I know that why I say arguably is because user wouldn't know that they're going to cause a race condition, right? They're not going to know that. But of course, the multiple users are hitting your APIs, so that could very well happen. Everything is 500. Starting with 500 is bad, really bad, that you didn't handle some exception, you didn't handle some errors, and you returned 500 back. Some bad gateway happened, which is 502. Services going through some maintenance, 503. And then 500 internal server error is the most infamous, worst error. Please don't return that. Because as a developer, I really don't like it. Idempotency. We talked about the options a little bit. I skipped patch. I'm going to talk about that in a second. How many of you have actually used the patch method in your APIs? A lot of people have used it. So then if you use it, you know that it has one inherent problem. The problem is that it's not by default idempotent. When you have a put method has an advantage that it is idempotent, meaning that if you take a body of an entity, keep calling the API again and again, even if you have intelligent code, nothing will change if the same data was sent. But even if you don't have such logic, the same entity gets overridden, but no new entities get created, which is not true with post, obviously, because post will really just create new entities. But when you say patch, let's say I have 3 fields that I was talking about, name, age, country, for example. I'm a developer A, and I try to change the name of a person. I only send the name. I don't send the whole entity. And I get 204 no content status code back, because I'm not returning the entity when the update has happened. Developer B here also makes a change, but they change the age or country or whatever the other field is. They're thinking that that age or country has changed, but the other fields are intact. But actually what has happened is there's a lost update problem because my data that I just updated might have gotten lost, right? So in order to handle that, you can either go all the medieval way of handling that by having a last updated date time in your database, check it against the database. That means every time you have to send an API call, you also have to send that the last modified date when you retrieve the entity. But the modern way in the web to do that is using ETags. Have you guys used ETags? Okay, so you feel people have used ETags. So quickly I'll go over that. ETags is alphanumeric value that shows the sanctity of a record that was just returned back to you. So if you want to change anything in that, you have to check by using if match header that you only make the change when this entity tag is actually matching. So that means the entity hasn't been changed on the server side. So that will handle your last update problem for patch. Hypermedia is the engine application state that I talked about. What the essence of this talk one thing if you want to take away is that you have to have APIs that are predictable. The APIs that are, I don't have to think a lot, cognitive dissonance, that means I have to figure things out. I should be able to deterministically call such APIs. And that's the main thing in the HATEOAS system, is that we are providing some embedded help or links or navigational attributes or embedded documentation inside your API response. And also, I considered a live example that I had. I have a designer slash developer hybrid in our company. And I generally give them some JSON object to bind some data to do some testing on their end. But they're not able to, but they're a savvy diviner, so they're able to, they want to be able to change some attributes, get new data. How do they know that the fields that I have given them are the only fields that are in the entity? Or how do they know that what other records are out there as well? So in order to solve that problem, if you consider this, we have added now in this base result set, we added a links section. And we have 2 links here. One is the players 1A. That just shows you the URL, how you got to this result set. If I had given this data to somebody, now they'll be able to take a look at this URL. It's kind of like a hyperlink. They'll be able to replicate that and get result again anywhere. Okay? And they can change the base URL to another environment, still get some results back. Schema. If I had given them only these 4 fields, but there are actually 6 fields. I'll show you an example where we will be able to filter some field set as well. Now, by schema, they can take a look at all the attributes that are out there, what their data types are, and they're able to get some more help from this schema link. And you can see the schema is starting with $, just to show that it's not an actual entity. You're not doing any get, post, put, etc. on this. It's just to show you the schema value. It's kind of similar to old-fashioned WSTL, but it's not that old, obviously. And majority of the frameworks that allow you to implement OData will automatically include a schema link, and then you can formulate that in your HATEOAS links as well when you're returning the result set. But you also notice one more thing, that I had a game ID 1G in this result set. But where does it say in this API response that it is of another entity? The person who is trying to use the sample data doesn't know that. So what we want to do is add information about that as well in the HATEOAS. We're going to say, okay, you know what? There's another game entity involved, and that's 1G. And I didn't talk about REL. I'll talk about that in a second as well. And the schema is this. REL is game. So that's the relationship of this player with the games. And similarly, previously, in the first example, this players or self. So you can use either players or self, because the body that you receive here is of what entity? That is what is showing here in the REL. The relationship is actually self. Now, I want to talk about the Open Data Framework. How many of you actually use the Open Data Framework, OData? I'm very curious about this. Maybe 6, 7 people have used it. About 10 years ago, I went to speak in a conference in Microsoft called the Tech Ready, and I heard about a framework called Sitka framework. And in Sitka framework, the promise was that you can write SQL-like statements in the URL, and you'll be able to easily retrieve the results. And nowadays, I didn't follow that project for many years. Later, I realized that SAP and Microsoft worked on building something similar a few years ago. As a developer, I want to have predictability in what I can retrieve, what I can change, what are the fields out there, what data types are out there. And I also want to not hack my API URLs by just putting some get or actions or some method instead of being RESTful. I want to stick with the RESTfulness. We'll go to that section as well. So quickly, what are different keywords for OData? And all these things that have a $, prefix to them are going to be in the URL. Select is very similar to where clause, select clause of a TSQL or ANSI SQL even. So in the parentheses, I have put the database query equivalents of these attributes. Filters like a where clause, top and offset. As a name, you can put these two things together, and you can implement paging in your APIs, and then do more intelligent coding and do even caching based on these paging parameters. Expand is a little bit of a special case. I showed an example where you had player and then you had the game embedded inside, but I only had returned the game ID, right? And if I have 100 players data that I'm retrieving, and each one of them have, I don't know, let's say 5, 6 different games that are aggregated with them, I don't want to expand all the games entities. Or even if there is one, I don't want to add the games data, because the user can always make another API call to get the games details, right? Especially when we added the navigation link inside the HATEOAS link. But what if I want to work on an instance or even a collection, and I do want to expand that little entity that is aggregated? So the $expand will allow us to do that. I'm going to take a look at some examples of these anyways. Order by is just simply sorting, and then count is just return no records, but just the number of records in the response. In this example, you can see that I want to work on the collection of players, but I only want to return the name. I don't want to return any other attributes. This is a projection, so horizontal filtering of the result set. And you can see that if I give somebody this data section, they will know that I put some condition, that's why I only got a filtered response. Now, the diviner can go back and change this select is equal to name, comma, ID, comma, something else, and they will be able to get more attributes as well. And they'll also be able to take a look at this URL and be able to retrieve the whole schema as well. Where clause or the filter clause is very similar. Filter name, EQ, AB, kind of quirky syntax, a little bit it takes to get used to, but then after that, you can see that we have combined another OData attribute with that. I only want to retrieve ID and name, but I want to filter based on somebody's name is AB. And then you can see that you got this result. You may argue, gosh, there's no game inside this body. Why do I have the game section, right? You can open a bug on me then. So now, next topic is the top and offset, which is very similar to, the database. In the database also, you implement similar things. You have offset, you have limit and top, depending on the database system you're using. So this is very important when you're implementing paging on the server side in the database itself, and so that the developers don't have to, get all the results set, cache them, and try to do some munging on them to return that to the UIs. Expand example I gave earlier. We have players 1A, so we're working on an instance here, and we're saying expand only the game section, aggregated entity, because I could have more also. I could have game, I could have trophies, I could have some other entities which are aggregated with this. I could expand all of them by saying expand is equal to game, comma, trophy, comma, something else. But you can see that I got one result set. Now it saved me making another API call to the server, because obviously somebody had to make the API call to get that data on the server side, but at least you will reduce a turn from the client side. Sorting, very simple. You get a collection players, order by name. You could also do DESC next to that by giving a space, and it'll give you a descending order of sorting. And you can put all these things together and get more meaningful results from your API. And you can see so far we have kept our APIs RESTful. We have not gone from the RESTfulness at all. But before I go to the next example, you might have run into a situation where you want to run a function or a method on the results that you have before the data is returned to the client. And what you want to do is not actually a status variable. So I want to check, for example, return me all the players that have trophies that have not expired yet. But there is no expiry field in the trophy. Okay. Take an example of a credit card you have, and you lost the card, but the system where it was saved doesn't know that yet. So that means you want to validate the card before it is returned back to the user. So we want to do some function, okay? And when you talk to some developers, they're like, yeah, we will create a special case actions URL or a get something URL or method inside the URL, which is not really RESTful, right? Before we go to the API, let's take a look at this example in C#. In C#, you have Lambda expressions. Also, Java has Lambda expressions, so you can use very similar looking. Actually, they're all based on Lambda calculus, if you remember your old classes. Now, what we're doing is we're working on a players entity, which is a generic collection in this case. We want to get any player, where the predicate variable is P. Basically, P is the instance member, so it iterates over all the players. And when it gets the first one, it checks, and the second one and third one and so forth. Address and city is this, and we also want to take a look at this predicate. This is the instance at that time, validate its trophies. This is really an extension method in C# provided on top of this entity player. And then you want to convert that to a collection, return that. How about doing that in a URL? Okay. So consider the Lambda expression in OData in the URL, where you have players entity, $filter, which is our where clause, where players /any. Again, we want to replicate the same thing that we do in Lambda expression. P:/P. P is greater than equal is it's the same thing, is just represented differently. Syntax is different. Idea is exactly the same. P/address/city EQ foster city, and P will have an extension method on the server side that will validate the trophies for this P player, and then it'll keep yielding that only after all the records have been processed. So that means you will do a dynamic function on the collection before you return back to the client. It's really difficult to implement that without having any standard. Now, if I have this, I can implement more methods on the server side and then put them on this P or C or whatever my predicate variable is, and have a predictable result set. The next thing I want to talk about is the webhooks. This is not about asynchronous APIs. I think asynchronous APIs, you want to not basically wait to give a response back to the user. You want to say, okay, here's a request number. I'll let you know when your stuff is ready. I'll make an API call to you. But how about extending that and then providing the ability to subscribe to anything? It's very timely that the previous talk that before me was talking about the Kafka queue and how they were creating entities and events, and then how you were publishing, how somebody was subscribing and then getting notified. Now, doing that in the web, in the HTTP, is very similar. Obviously, in the backend, you're going to have some Kafka queue or something, MSMQ, RabbitMQ, or whatever technology you want to use. But I'm focused on the API usability front end of the API. So event, so this is what developer, a user of your API is actually making call to you and saying, hey, you know what, notify me every time a player gets created. So player is entity, player is the event. And I also want to be able to filter that for only this user ID, let me know. I can skip that completely, and then I will be notified in my system for any user that is trying to create a new player. State is active or inactive, because when millions of your users, millions is too many, I think, maybe let's say hundreds of thousands of your clients use your APIs, they create lots of these webhooks, subscribe webhooks, and then they're also getting lots of data that they don't really need. So what they want to do is they want to be able to deactivate the webhook for a certain time. But what's the meaty thing in here is the callback. This is what will be invoked when we do get a player created in our system. Whenever that Kafka queue actually finds something, you just notify somebody, and that's where the URL comes into picture. So our system is going to invoke this URL, but it's not just going to invoke it and send the data as is. It's going to use a symmetric key. It's a shared secret that you have exchanged with the client already. You're going to use that to encrypt the data and then send the data to this URL. But when you send the data, it has to be, this URL should also be authenticated. It should have some base 64-based user and password, basic authentication. And then also when the users try to integrate with their APIs, they might be calling it from their lower level environment, which may not be ready sometimes. So you want to be able to do retries as well. So that's why retry function is given. I'm at time, so I'm going to stop right here. And if there are any questions, we can discuss them later. Thank you.